Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Roberta, and I'm the project manager at the Swiss Consulate here in Chicago. Thank you to IRMI and the Goethe-Institut for your continued collaboration on the Science and Fiction series. Today, we are exploring the science and fiction in the science fiction realm. From the imaginary and sci-fi narratives in games, films, and books to the facts and figures in the hard sciences, how does the genre affect the human psyche, society, and our action? What does this exchange look like between the imaginary and reality? To moderate today's exciting discussion, it is my pleasure to introduce Jordan Erica Weber. Some of you will recognize her from our latest science and fiction event featuring video games, narratives, and design. Weber, a multi-hyphenate, if I can use this word, is a gaming expert, arts and culture presenter, podcast host, and author of 10 Things Video Games Can Teach Us About Life, Philosophy, and Everything, which takes a deep dive into many sci-fi stories in the gaming world. Of course, she is also a big fan of the sciences. So let's get started on this exploration. Jordan, take it away.
So welcome to both of you. I'm sure that you will both have a lot of thoughts to share with everyone. But first, I kept my introductions of you deliberately brief because I wanted to give you a chance to talk a bit more about yourselves. You are the best people to talk about yourselves. So would you mind telling us a little bit more about yourselves, your work, and your special interest in science fiction? Georg, would you like to go first?
Okay. The other day, I met with an old friend, and he remembered me that we in the 70s we were both members of a fanzine called Science Fiction Times, and then I more or less forgot this period of my life, but it was very interesting to talk about the good old days, because there were days of struggle. There was a struggle which way science fiction will take, and it was just like science fiction was all our lives, science fiction and music. So we identified ourselves with the help of the science fiction, and we identified also our enemies. So the struggle in the 70s, 80s was the big change in the genre. The golden days were over, and we were searching for the new the new quotation marks science fiction. Yes, that's it. And then you go more and more adult and more cool. And but it's very nice to remember those days where these issues were so vital.
I definitely want to talk about how science fiction has changed through the decades. So I'll definitely come back to you with some questions about that. But Simon, would you like to tell us a bit more about yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. And hello, everybody. I have to say, I'm a bit in awe here that I'm sharing this the panel with Georg, so to speak, because obviously when I started my research on science fiction, who was on my shelf, or which books were on my shelf? Of course, the books by Georg Seeßlen. He's the name you couldn't get around at that time. My connection to science fiction is actually, I don't know, it's maybe a bit boring, because although I've been doing research on science fiction for the last 20 years, I have never really considered myself a fan. And of course, there are science fiction films which I love very much. I mean, I always like to say my favorite film is 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick, but that's actually not true, because Berlin is actually my favorite film. But I mean, 2001 is certainly very important for me. And I mean, in a way, a science fiction film stood at the very beginning of my love for cinema. I was 16 years old when I saw Blade Runner for the first time in an open air screening, and this screening basically changed my life. It was the start of a big love, a big passion, but mainly for cinema and not so much for science fiction. I mean, of course, I've been returning to Blade Runner again and again, but I don't know. I mean, it's I certainly cannot say that I had the same kind of, I don't know, identification or fight about the genre as Georg has, but yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm interested in it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have worked on it for so long.
Absolutely. Well, you've told us some of your favorite films. Georg, what's your favorite science fiction?
2001 is certainly for everyone, I think, because it's, you know, like the big novels like Moby Dick or Don Quixote. It's a film that developed in itself. It began as a normal science fiction satire even, and it changed and changed, and on the end it was a religious or maybe drug experience, and of course it was a visual a masterpiece. I don't think it has any real successor. It's an isolated masterpiece. Maybe it has not so as much to do with the development of the genre. For discussing the genre, I would like to talk about B movies, like the invasion of the body snatchers and so on.
I mean, I very much agree to that. I actually wrote when there was the 50th birthday of the 2001. I actually wrote a piece where I argued that it had no consequence for the genre whatsoever, which of course is exaggerated, but I would certainly say that in
Absolutely
many ways
true.
It had, in terms of content, in terms of style, and in terms of production, it's really nothing compares to it. You can even say that actually some of the, even in terms of special effects, because most of the stuff which was developed for the movie turned out to be much too expensive and complicated, so no one really took it up later. So it's really it's a movie of its own completely.
I would
totally agree.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely be interested to hear what some of our attendees think about 2001: A Space Odyssey, and if they agree with both of you that it hasn't been as influential as people might assume. I definitely think some of the people watching will have some thoughts on that. I do find it interesting, though, what you say, Georg, about it being, it turning into, it kind of expands beyond its genre. It's not just science fiction, it changes into something else. Because if I can talk about some of my favorite science fiction just for a second, I recently finished watching The Expanse, the televised adaptation of the novels by James S.A. Corey, and they deal with a lot of politics. And this is something that I'm not normally keen on politics in my television, in my entertainment. But because it's science fiction, it kind of allowed me to enjoy that in a way that I wouldn't otherwise. And I wondered if you think that there is a sense in which science fiction allows us to explore ideas that we wouldn't otherwise want to at a kind of safe distance. What do you think about that, Georg?
But I can only talk about my own experience, and I know, for instance, traveling for Goethe to a lot of very, very different countries and very different scenes. So science fiction was also the like a safe space. You could talk about big science fiction films, big great novels, and you could say to the censors, "Oh, we are talking science fiction, not politics." So it's masquerade, and this masquerade of political issues has always been the difference of science fiction from other genres like melodrama or like thrillers. They are more concentrated on psychological problems, on the inner problems, but science fiction was also always a means of discussing where we have to go as a society. But on the other hand, I think this is all only the surface, and maybe we go further and further and come to a core.
Absolutely. Simon, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just unfortunately, I haven't watched The Expanse yet. I have to admit, but I mean, yes and no. I mean, of course. I mean, in a way, the whole point of science fiction is what we in academic literature is called estrangement. So science fiction always talks about the world we live in by showing something completely else. Because I mean, and I don't think I'm saying actually something which is really new. Science fiction is, of course, not about the future. It's about the present. It's about the world we live in. So I would agree to that. On the other hand, I have to say that for me, I'm often actually much more interested in the aesthetics, in how these films work on a formal level, what they actually do visually and in the sound and so on. So for me, to actually be an interesting movie, it doesn't necessarily actually have to deal with really big ideas. If interesting stuff happens on a aesthetic level, I'm already happy.
Okay, so Simon, just for argument's sake then, what's kind of your definition of science fiction? Because I feel like a lot of people would define it as something that explores big ideas through kind of alternate realities, but it sounds like you've probably got another definition.
Science fiction is everything that looks like science fiction, which means science. Very briefly, science fiction always takes place in a world which is different from the one we live in. There's always at least this one element which changed the world fundamentally, which is called the novum. The novum is the thing which makes it different. It can be several of those: time travel, I don't know, robots, androids, fast and light travel, whatever you want. And the question is always, how can you differentiate it from fantasy, which also deals with stuff which is not of our world. And the big difference of between science fiction and fantasy is that science fiction always has at least the inherent claim that it actually takes place in the world we live in, that it's an expansion and extension of our world, that it is somehow, be it historically or geographically, connected to our universe. And that at least in principle, the same laws applies in terms of physics and so on. And although all kinds of stuff happens which we know perfectly well are completely impossible, there's always the inherent claim that this could actually is compatible with the world we live in. And in film, this is made manifest by a specific aesthetics, which always is a techno-scientific aesthetic. I mean, the interesting thing is we see a spaceship in a movie, and we immediately know that it's a spaceship, although none of us has ever seen a spaceship. We instantly recognize it as a spaceship because it looks like something like technology, something made by human beings, something which is not powered by magic, but which is something which has been built by human beings or whatever. So that's a big difference. And it's, I mean, there are long discussions among fans hard SF, soft SF, and what is possible and what's not possible, but that's not the point. I mean, if you look at it, especially in movies, I would say about 95% of what we see in movies is obviously completely impossible, but it's still science fiction because there's always the inherent claim that it's part of our world, which is completely different to at least like a Tolkien fantasy, which makes it very clear from the beginning, this is in a secondary world, this is a world separated from the one we live in. So that's
okay. Well, you've answered a bunch of the questions I have already in one go, so that's great. I think we've got someone in the chat saying, Ralph Dumas saying science fiction is essentially naturalistic, not supernatural, which sounds like kind of what you're saying there. Although I will ask you, speaking of recent science fiction or what people call science fiction, I did watch the Dune movie, the recent Dune movie in preparation for this. And I know that people argue about whether that is science fiction or whether it technically is fantasy. Where do you fall on that, Simon? It has spaceships, so.
Yeah, I mean, all these things. I mean, there's never there are always all kinds of shades of gray, and there are all kinds of mixtures. I mean, the prime example would be Star Wars, which was actually heavily influenced by Dune. So where you have both, where you have the Force, which is obviously a magical element, and where you have the spaceship. And I would say Dune is, if you have like two poles, here pure fantasy, here pure science fiction. Star Wars is like in the middle, and I would say Dune is a bit more on the science fiction side. I mean, it clearly has, I mean, all the Bene Gesserit and stuff like that, you could say that's actually more like magic. Also, it's at least implicitly, it says actually this is somehow compatible. I would say it's more on the science fiction side, but it certainly has a fantasy bent to it.
So, Georg, are you more interested in how science fiction explores ideas, or like Simon, are you more interested in the kind of form of science fiction film?
Both.
Both. Excellent.
Yeah. I think it's true what Simon said, that science fiction is not about the future. It's not a futurologic genre. It's not about predictions, and but we can go back to the roots of the genre, and then we see why it had to develop. It's a must. We couldn't cope with our societies without science fiction, whether we know it or not. And on the roots, you can go back to the end of the 18th century, where the first philosophers were talking about economy, and there developed the two great, I think, the great elements of the modern thinking, and one is progress. So I think it's the turning point that we say no, we are not anymore in the hands of God, and that's it. Also, so we human beings are to make themselves in the society, in the nature. And at the same time, one philosopher, he was also I think theologic, yeah.
Theologian.
Theologian, yeah, thank you. Thomas Malthus, and he defined a relationship between progress and nature, and progress and the population and feed, and so he was the one who was talking about the limits of progress, or how can that progress is no just a linear way of development. And so we have the two certainties in at least at the European societies. We have to make progress, and there are limits to the progress, and the limits are very dramatic, because it means hunger, it means war, it means migration. And I think that science fiction films and literature helps us to live with this contradiction, because we have to develop progress, and we have to fear the progress at the same time. So science fiction is a lot about fear. I think it's the genre of fear.
Interesting. And that sounds like the thinking about fear of progress, but also having to make progress. That sounds like it kind of aligns with Simon's interest in utopia and dystopia in science fiction, which we will definitely come on to talk about. I did want to, since you mentioned kind of going back to the 1880s, though, should we talk about the history of science fiction and some of the earliest examples? I suppose, since you two are experts in film, perhaps you want to start in film rather than going back to Edward Bellamy or whatever. But Georg, I suppose maybe you're the best person to ask. But have you noticed any kind of big trends in how science fiction has changed over the decades? The interest in it, the kind of content in it? I know it's a big question.
Yes, it is. But I think in the development of the genre, there are some plot points, and maybe you if you would ask me who is the most important science fiction writer, I would answer David Bowie, and you could. I think you can follow the history of science fiction with 3 songs of David Bowie. The first, when he was a singer-songwriter, not very known. He was experimenting with his persona, and he wrote a song called Uncle Arthur. And Uncle, he described in this song a dreamer. He liked this Uncle Arthur who was still reading comics, who was still reading science fiction as an adult, and who wouldn't function as a normal adult and the normal bourgeois. Of course, the second big science fiction song was the Space Oddity, where he described the isolation, the fear, and a decade later, in Ashes to Ashes, David Bowie told us, we all know Major Tom is a junkie. So it was not only the killing of his own persona, but it was also a reflection of the genre itself, because in this time, from one song to the other, the big expectations of space travel and technical development lost the fascination. We are kind of cool down. No, we don't go to Venus. We don't go to in another cosmic but they developed the other side, the digital world, and we developed a more interest in the inner space, and not the problem was, I think the problem of science fiction and the fear of science fiction at the moment is not space, is not it is not apocalyptic views of social distortion and social civil wars, and so it is the very deep fear of losing the human identity, of losing the Kantian or the Hegelian connection between the I and the world. We lose the world and we lose the I. And this is, I think, the modern science fiction is all about.
I think it's interesting that you bring in David Bowie, because of course one of the most recent ways that David Bowie has kind of intersected with the world of science fiction is that Chris Hadfield, an astronaut, sung Space Oddity on the space station. So that kind of legacy is still filtering through to what feels like realized science fiction. So somebody in the chat has just mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson. Anne-Marie Stoll says the greatest science fiction writer of the present time. I am inclined to agree. I am a big fan of Kim Stanley Robinson, and Simon says he is as well. Simon, what appeals to you so much about his work?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure whether he's the greatest science fiction writer, but I think he's really among the current writers really quite unique. What is the unique thing about him? I mean, he is in a way one of the super hard science fiction writers, meaning that there's all the science is extremely well researched and everything very meticulous, and he's very realistic, but at the same time he's really in some ways a very grounded guy and very realistic in what he can do, but at the same time he is definitely on a mission. He wants to change the world with his writing. He is really an utopian in the true sense that his writing is basically for the last 40 years a big political project, and which I find really fascinating, because on the one hand he is definitely in this long tradition of utopian writing, which he knows very well, but at the same time he's very well aware of all his shortcomings and always reflects that. And his last book, The Ministry for the Future, I'm actually not really sure whether it's an absolute masterpiece or whether it's a completely impossible book, but because he does, formally he does completely crazy things there. The book is not even a novel anymore. It's more like a collage or something. And big part of it takes place in Zurich, which is great anyway. So for me, reading that book was very moving, because Stan has lived in Zurich for several years. He loves the city very well, and this book is in many ways a sum of all he has written, and also a love letter to this city. And for me, reading the book was very, very strange, because basically I would read a chapter and I get on my bike and just bike the places he has written about. So that was really a very strange experience for me. But
the appeal of it was the reality.
Yeah, he is, in one way he's very realistic, but on the other way he takes this then to always reflect about different ways to organize society, and he's never naive about that. The Mars trilogy is basically one long, it's 3 books, but it's one long book about failed attempts to establish a better society, and how we could do it, and why it won't work, and why we have to do it again, and why we have to do it again. So, just a short commercial break, my new book, which is basically out this week, at the beginning it starts with a quote by Robinson from the Ministry of the Future. So just to underscore how he's a really important writer for me. As I said, I don't know whether I know much too little about the current science fiction literature to really say whether he's the greatest writer, but he's certainly an important writer for me. But again, I think he's in many ways something completely of its own, because he does something which in a way is actually completely impossible, and he's very aware of that.
Yeah, I put a link to an interview with him in the chat that I found really interesting. He talks about his work as political activism, and he also discusses in the interview why his books tend to be so fact heavy. Talks about, you know, when you set things in the future in order to make them feel relatable to people, you do kind of have to go a bit overboard with the facts. But yeah, should we talk about utopia and dystopia in science fiction then, since we bring up Kim Stanley Robinson? I know people might be inclined to call him dystopian, but I think he regards himself as a utopian writer, just kind of a realist one. What I'm interested in asking both of you is if you've noticed any trends in utopian and dystopian fiction, and whether one, because I think in books, you know, one seems to be more popular than another at any one time. But Simon, we were talking earlier before we started recording, and you said you don't think utopia, it's very rare in film, and it might not really work. Do you want to maybe start there? Why do you think that is?
I mean, how to start this? No, I mean, maybe I start another way. I often get asked, so why aren't there any positive utopias in film anymore? That's the question. I mean, I get that. I don't know. I feel like I get that every second week or something. And my answer is always, when have there ever been positive utopias in film? And I would say film and literature are really different in this way. At least when we talk about fiction film, there never were, the future in movies was never positive in fiction film. And if you actually look at it, I mean, very briefly, before the 1950s, at least in the US, there is basically no science fiction genre with very few exceptions. Then the first 2 decades after 1950s, very few films actually take place in the future for various reasons. One reason is that most of these movies were low-budget movies, and it's much more expensive to set a film in the future. And basically, the moment science fiction films move into the future, they are dystopian. In the 70s, we get all these dystopias because that's the moment, or late 60s, when science fiction moves into the future. And the reason that these films are dystopian is very obvious, because happiness is not interesting narratively. A love story ends when the lovers are united, because then there's nothing interesting to tell anymore. You need conflict. You need something which doesn't work. And a future where everybody's happy, that in itself is not interesting. Is not interesting for a story. And if you actually look at utopian literature, more or less until the end of the 19th century, these are not novels in the modern sense. These are not books which are interesting about telling an interesting story. It changes in the 19th century and so on. And you mentioned Bellamy before, so there you have a kind of romance thrown into it. But basically, for almost 400 years, utopias are not about telling a story. And if you come back to Robinson, what he does is, of course, it is an utopian tradition, but it's very far away from what actually classic literary utopias do. And my argument is, and that's again commercial break, that's what my latest book is about, that I'm saying actually, if you want to look at utopias in film, you don't look for them in fiction film, because they don't exist. Look for them in non-fiction film, look for them in documentaries and propaganda film, and then you get all kinds of cinematic utopias. Because again, the literary utopia is actually not fiction proper, so to speak. It's not about telling an interesting plot. It's about a reflection of what is bad in the current society. Utopia, and again, as science fiction is not really about the future, utopia is never really about utopian place. Utopia is always about what is not working in the here and now, and about that things don't have to be as shitty as they are, that we can think of alternatives.
Shall we give attendees some homework and see if anyone can guess what the film is in your background while we carry on talking? Speaking of utopia and dystopia. Georg, and what you said earlier about science fiction being about fear, talking again about how things have changed through the decades and the popularity of kind of different topics that are explored in science fiction. How do science fiction films over the past few decades reflect the kind of the political fears of the day?
First of all, I have a little objection because
Okay.
we are talking about an definition of utopia that's very from the idealistic and European Christian view, and it means it's not only we go to a better world, but also we go to a perfect world. So the utopia would be the construction of a perfect world. And of course,
I disagree. I disagree. Utopia is not about perfection, but go on.
Okay,
I'm sure
okay.
some people do think that, though. You're right. You're right.
Yes,
Yeah.
I didn't wanted to criticize your
No, it's okay.
discourse. No, but there is another maybe another practice of utopian, thinkers like Ernst Bloch would take it, and that's about the how Bloch described it, practicing hope, and a hope where you act to it, not only expect it, but you do something for it, and maybe it will never come. But you act for it, and the utopian view in a story is not where you get, but the energy so for instance, for me, Star Trek is utopian because you feel this little strange, little common triangle of logic, humanism, and this guy who is he's a hero. So they control themselves, this triangle, Spock, Kirk, and the doctor in Germany, it's called the Pille.
What's the doctor called? I'm sure someone in the audience will remind us.
McCoy is his name. So I think these also, of course, it's on a level for kiddies, but it is the idea of not only exploring and widening the empire, but to make new to see something new in a new way, and you can't do it as one person, as the hero. You can do it only in some kind of democratic collective. So the utopian view in science fiction is not where you go, but how do you move? So you find utopian things also in very depressing pictures, because it's about struggle for freedom or something like that, or and yeah, and the big changes, of course, depend on not only on the reflecting the political history, because of course the falling down of the communism was changed everything, and a big change also is the loss of Anglo-Saxon hegemony, the lead. Now we have very interesting science fiction from China, from India, from all over the world, even a very interesting African input. So this changes more than, let's say, one generation after the other. But of course, there is a political economy in producing films, producing literature, and there is the censorship of state and the censorship of the market. So you always will have to deal with mainstream, and the mainstream always is just the stuff you need to feel well. and for the Kim Stanley Robinson, I think this is a development, not utopian and not dystopian, but a new way of anti-dystopian.
Yes.
And this is interesting, because maybe we will overcome this strange duality, utopia, dystopia. Maybe the duality was wrong. So and we can develop just this kind of this, like in the dialectic way, the next step, you know, and look with a certain kind of hope, with a certain kind of energy, but without the so-called utopian expectations for always better, always greater, always progress. And this, I think, this is the reflection of our knowledge that progress is no longer the best idea for humanity.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's maybe a good place to end our little discussion just with the three of us and open it up to questions from the attendees. As we've said, please let us know who your question is addressed to, if it's addressed to someone in particular. I will just pick up on something that Diane has just said, though. Diane says they appreciate the triangle metaphor used in the description of Star Trek, so that's a good one. But also they want to know, please mention international science fiction authors. And obviously we mentioned that there is excellent science fiction coming out of China and India and Africa. I'll mention Nnedi Okorafor is one of my favorites. Ralph points out Korean science fiction on television, so that's a recommendation. Do either of you have any kind of international sci-fi authors to specifically recommend? I suppose we are international here, but I guess from countries we've not mentioned.
I mean, that's not bad. Since I mainly talk about movies, I mean, what's interesting is, I mean, one of the big change, of course, of the last 20 years or something, is of course that Hollywood is completely dominated by the big franchises, and they are all more or less in science fiction, the science fiction realm, and actually all the Avengers movies, most of them are really well done. But below this, which basically takes all our attention, a lot of interesting stuff is made, and also some of them in Europe. I mean, for me, the greatest not only science fiction film, but so far the best film of the 21st century, that's Under the Skin, which is a British production with Scarlett Johansson in the leading role, which I think is really one of the great masterpieces of cinema history. And there especially, I mean, I have to say I know very little about non-Western film traditions, but I mean, once you leave Hollywood behind, and I'm not saying I have nothing against the good Hollywood entertainment, but there's a lot of interesting smaller production. For example, there's this Swedish production Aniara about this spaceship which goes on to a journey forever. Very few people know it, but I think it's one of the most interesting science fiction films of the last few years. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on also in Europe. And I mean, someone in the chat said Netflix is all about globalization, which is of course true, but at the same time, it really makes films possible which wouldn't have been possible a few years ago. So there's a interesting tension here between a market logic which dictates everything, but at the same time makes stuff possible which wasn't possible before. So again, it's utopia and dystopia.
Mm-hmm. If any of you watching have recommendations for non-Western science fiction that we should be checking out, then do let us know. I did watch The Wandering Earth on Netflix, the adaptation of Liu's novel. It was bombastic. I don't know if it was necessarily the best, highest quality science fiction I've ever seen, film I've ever seen, but worth checking out, definitely. I watched it on a train. So Ralph says, I've seen Aniara, based on Nobel Prize winning novel by Harry Martinson. Epic poem, not novel. And Read Work by Vandana Singh, they recommend as well. So that's something for us to check out. We've had so many messages in the chat. Let me scroll through. Earlier on in the conversation, somebody was asking if we could talk about Blade Runner and Metropolis. Have either of you seen Metropolis? Do you have thoughts on that?
Georg, please.
It's a little bit problematic to talk about because there are a lot of books, a lot of articles, a lot of discussions on behalf of this film. It's so in itself so contradictory. It has the best things in its time for you could think and you could make, and also the worst. If you have two critics talking about Metropolis, they won't get to an end, because you can enter at the left and you can enter at the right. You can enter in the ideological way, or in the aesthetic way, or in the technical way. It's fantastic. We showed it in the Goethe-Institut at Beijing, and the discussion went on and on and on, and I think it's 2 years ago. I think it's ongoing, because this is so contradictory.
I mean, I completely agree. I always like to say that I know no other film where the discrepancy between form and brilliance and stupidity of content is so huge. Because I mean, obviously it is, in terms of how it's made, how it looks and so on, it is a masterpiece. But I mean, just the ending where I mean, I don't know how it's in English, aber Mittel zwischen Hirn und Hand muss das Herz sein. So that you have to have a medium between a brain and arm, and that has to be hard. I mean, that was stupid back then, and it's even more stupid now.
Fair enough.
The interesting thing,
sorry,
excuse me, but the interesting thing, because in dealing with film history, you have also to write a history of the audience, and the interesting thing about Metropolis is that it was no success. It was one of the biggest flop in German film history, because it was so far away from the everyday experience, and it was in that behalf it was much too utopian. And interesting thing that followed up the Metropolis in the German film industry were made a lot, let's say 7, 6 science fiction films with much lesser technical means, and with more simplistic plots, and they very successful. So the Metropolis, I think, is an heritage, but it's also kind of enigmatic, because maybe there is so much subconsciousness, so much dream and nightmare in it. So you need a psychoanalytical way to analyze it also. Like Simon said, it's also a reflection of coming fascist ideas, and it has humanistic and for instance, just you have to work a year with your students only about the different versions of this film. This, it was butchered sometimes, and sometimes it was a little more renewed, but the real film, the film that was thought and made in the first, that doesn't exist. It's only, we have versions that are always interpretations.
We have only about 5 minutes left, but somebody in the chat is asking if we can discuss Arrival, a more recent science fiction film. Have either of you seen it?
Sure. Yeah. What can I say? I have to say it's. I mean, as I said in the chat, it's based on a short story by Ted Chiang, which is an absolute masterpiece. I mean, Chiang is one of the really great short story writers of our time. I have to say I wasn't really as convinced by this movie. I think it starts very strong, is very strong for a long time, and then in the end it just drops everything it has established out of the window, because suddenly, I mean, it's about this linguist who tries to establish contact with these aliens, and it takes a lot of time. How can she talk with them who have a completely different, not only language, but a way of thinking? And then in the crucial moment, suddenly she can just talk to her with her mind, and everything is solved. To do this, you get subtitles so you know what they're thinking. And I was just like, okay, here the director has completely dropped the ball, because now it's the moment where you have to show us how you can do that, and he cannot do it. And I was really disappointed, because I thought it made a lot of things. It did well, and then in the crucial moment for me, it completely failed. But I know there are many people who like it very much.
No, I think I completely agree with you. I liked it very much up until the ending. I know that a lot of people out there in the world don't like science fiction, or at least they think that they don't like science fiction. There are a lot of people who say, no, it's completely not for me. I wonder, what do you think it is that puts some people off so strongly?
I mean, I think it's, I mean, in one way I would say, at least if you look at literature, many people don't realize that they have been reading science fiction for decades. I mean, many of the high literature with big L, which is written today, is more or less science fiction. Thomas Pynchon is obviously very much influenced by science fiction, and I think very many of the, for example, contemporary US authors, even if they don't get sold under science fiction, it actually is science fiction. So I think people often don't realize what they're reading, and I think in the end it has a lot to do with aesthetics. I mean, for example, I talked about with my mother, she says, I'm just not interested in these films with these strange beings. So she doesn't like this kind of aesthetics, which I can understand to some degree, because me, for example, and I know this is like something completely ignorant to say, I don't really like fantasy, because I don't like this medieval aesthetics. I'm bored by it, and I know completely well, if I would get more into it, I would see all kinds of differences, which I don't see now, and it's actually much more complex than I realized. But it's not something which I'm attracted to, and I think that in terms of movies, this is really one of the important things, that there is I mean, not all science fiction looks the same, but there is a kind of aesthetics which some people just are not attracted by. And in literature, it's a bit different. If you don't have glaring covers with aliens and tentacles and stuff, you actually buy this book and don't realize that you've actually been reading science fiction. So,
no, that's a really good point. What do you think, Georg?
Yeah, I'm concerned about my history of science fiction, because my parents wouldn't allow me to read science fiction. Why wouldn't they allow me to read science? And they wouldn't allow me to read comics. So I went into comics and science fiction. In my generation, it was a rebellious, critical energy in it. But I think it's all about the concept of representation. There's a dogma. You have to represent reality in let's say one way term, yeah, and everything that goes beyond this representation of reality makes you the dreamer of David Bowie, and the dreamer is unable to succeed, is unable to learn, is unable to do his duty. So they feared this. In science fiction we have this word sense of wonder, and there was a fear of this sense of wonder because you went out of the discipline. You went out of the expectations, the educational expectations. It was more of hope in science fiction than it could fulfill, of course, as we all know. But
absolutely.
I mean, what the Georg said certainly exists, but I mean, of course, I mean, I'm sure Elsie will agree. This notion was wrong from the start anyway, because I mean, basically, at least since the early 20th century, there's no such thing as realism anymore. I mean, basically all literature starting with the 20th century has gone beyond the realism in many ways. And I mean, everything high modernism did was actually breaking down the very concept that there is something like this one realist point of view where you can actually construct a coherent world or something. And of course, in painting and art, and I don't know. So that's, I mean, this distinction never worked, although it's still made.
Yeah, that sounds like
course,
a very interesting conversation to have another time. I think we could talk for another whole hour about that, I'm sure. But we do need to wrap up. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming along to this event. And thank you so much to Georg and Simon for being here with me. I think